see it. You've got it,
Down
yeah?
the bottom, yeah.
Okay.
You're on.
Right, you're definitely recording. Yep, okay, I can see it, yeah. Okay, brilliant. All right, excellent. Welcome, everybody. Lovely to see so many of you here. Fantastic. It just goes to show, doesn't it, how much we are excited about Rioja. And I think now is a particularly good time to be excited about it. There's so much going on in the world of Rioja. I will try and explain some of that to you as I go through this presentation this evening. So just a brief introduction. I've seen a lot of familiar names there, which is wonderful. Lots and lots of new names too. So I'm Lauren. I work at WSET School London full-time. I started there about 3 years ago. I got my diploma in 2017. I'm currently Stage 1 Master of Wine student as well. One of the reasons I'm doing this webinar on Rioja is because I love, love, love Spain. I love all things Spain, all wines, Spanish. Some of you already know that I have big passion for sherry, but also Rioja. I was very lucky. I did WSET level 3 rather a while ago now. I think some of you here are doing that. And I was fortunate enough to get a scholarship from my results for that, and so that meant that I got taken across. It was from the Caballeros, the Gran Orden de Caballeros del Vino. I got taken across northern Spain by a Master of Wine, Angela Muir. There were 3 of us, and we did a 2-week tour, starting in Galicia, finishing in Catalonia. Part of that, of course, was dropping into Rioja and seeing what was going on there, and yeah, I mean, that really enhanced my perspective. It enhanced my my passion for Spanish wine, and just and forevermore I've been very passionate about these wines, and yeah, I'm really looking forward to sharing these sharing Rioja with you today. So yeah, please do type in some questions in the chat. Lydia, who is co-hosting, she can help answer some questions. She obviously knows a lot. She's a master of wine, and any that I see, I will also do my best, but I am kind of doing 2 things at once a bit. So if I can't answer straight away, please forgive me. So we're going to start with our first slide, if I can do that. Here we are. All right, so a little brief history of Rioja. It is one of the oldest still wine regions of Spain, and it kind of started in the 18th century. There were lots of people coming from Bilbao down into Rioja even, and producing wine there. Transport links got easier, so they were able to do that from there. So that's kind of the first time when the wine as we kind of know it to an extent was being made there. But the quality of the wine back then wasn't fantastic. I can see someone's drawing on my PowerPoint, not to worry. Okay, but things started to change a bit in the 1800s. So we've got there was some civil war back then, way back then, and some of the aristocracy were made to move away from where they were from, and a lot of them, well, a few of them went to Bordeaux. They learned a lot about winemaking in Bordeaux, and when they came back, they were using some techniques that were being used in Bordeaux, brought up the level of wine quite considerably as well. Originally, all wines were like the same price. It didn't matter what was done to them, where the grapes were from, and then that started to change, and so sort of levels of quality became more apparent, and so you would pay more, better quality. Before that just wasn't a thing. You may actually recognize some of these names. So Marqués de Murrieta, Marqués de Riscal, they were some of these producers. These are current houses, current Rioja producers, bodegas, and they were old aristocrats that came down and started doing these new winemaking techniques and things in Rioja. So that changed the face of Rioja to an extent. Then, of course, we got phylloxera. It came a little bit later because we're further south. So it already done awful things to Bordeaux, and actually that meant that there was a gap in the market in many parts of Europe for a wine, and Rioja was very good at filling that gap, but it wasn't immune itself, and eventually it also fell. It got phylloxera as well, and so that was a big problem, and it did mean that they weren't able in Spain to ship over their wines to the American colonies, because that was a big part of their distribution. They were able to sell a lot of their wines directly over to the Americas, and And that was what really helped Rioja in the first place, as a kind of a source of income and a demand, a market demand. And then when they couldn't do that, when they couldn't fill that demand, that was very problematic. However, in the same century, there were better transport links. So with the train station in Arrow, that revolutionized things as well. So it was possible to get the wines. There was a better route to market to other parts of Spain and other parts of Europe. Then in 1926, we've got the Rioja, the Consejo Regulador, that's the regulatory body, and that was establishing Rioja as one of the first wine regions in Spain. And then with the EU, the introduction of the EU in 1986, that has helped just generally improving as well, as it has done all over Spain and in other parts of Europe as well. So it's been a bit of a fluctuating turn of events, but now we have even more things happening, and the future as well is all to play for in Rioja right now. There's lots and lots of stuff going on, so I'm really excited to talk about that, as well as just the general styles and labelling terms that we would expect to see in our wines. So where are we? So in Spain, so Spain is the second most mountainous country in Europe. Switzerland is the most mountainous, and I think we don't expect that. We don't think about that when we go to Spain. Most of us, when we go to Spain, I don't know about you, but I mean, I tend to go down to the Costa Brava. I love it around there. Lots of people going down over the Costa del Sol. Got Alicante, got these really, really hot places. Of course, there's Jerez as well. And you don't look at these places and think that they're maybe bit north. We don't look at them and think they're particularly mountainous, but in the centre of Spain, it's very mountainous. We've got the Meseta going up from Madrid there, and you can see we've got these mountainous areas here, right close to where Rioja is. And we've also got this Atlantic influence as well. We're not too far from the coast. If you go to San Sebastian, you may as well spend a few more hours travelling and pop down to Rioja as well. And then, as we are going sort of southeast, we are coming towards the Mediterranean. So there's a hint of that Mediterranean influence there as well. But we are primarily in the north of Spain. It's not the hottest part of Spain. It's a moderate climate, really, with sometimes, bit more warmth in some areas than others. And I can focus on that in just a bit. Okay, but you can see what some of the wonderful other famous and well-known wine regions. We're just across the border from Navarra there. Navarra, they make similar styles, but also a lot of rosé, maybe a few more international grape varieties like Cabernet Sauvignon there. We're not a million miles from Ribera del Duero, also using Tempranillo grapes there a lot. Slightly different because it's a bit higher up generally. It's kind of a continental plateau there, a bit different. You may have heard of Toro, of course. We've got Rías Baixas over here, Albarino land, and then we've got these very hot parts in La Mancha, kind of lots of Monastrell coming from around here, and then Catalonia, of course, Cava land. Spain is wonderful for the diversity, and let's not forget Jerez. There we are, down there. Okay, so let's have a look at the sub-region. So zooming in now to Rioja. We've got 3 sub-regions, and these are going to become more important. We'll talk about those later on as well, because we have, even though it doesn't look like the largest area here, so we've got the most plantings going on in the Rioja Alta, followed pretty closely by the Rioja Baja. Now, ignore Baja here. In fact, I don't want that word to be there. I want another word to be there. I want Rioja Oriental to be there, because that's what it's now being referred to, and I'll explain why that is in just a moment. And then we've got this third smaller region, which is very much in the Basque country, in the Alava, and this is Rioja Alavesa. And actually, you can see that some of Rioja does overlap there into Navarra. So a little bit about each of these sub-regions. Okay, so we'll start with Rioja Alta. So Rioja means high. Okay, so we've got the Ebro running through. Okay, and we can see that Logroño is the main town here. So we're over to the west of Logroño mainly. It is quite warm in some parts of Rioja Alta, particularly closer to the river where it's a bit lower down, but it can get up to 700 meters. It has a lot of alluvial soils down by the river, and then it's got more sort of clay soils and some limestone on the more slopey mountainous parts. If we go down here now to the Rioja Oriental, now it used to be called Rioja Baja because it was downriver, okay, but the word Baja, it means low in Spanish. So now these terms are going to be seen more on labels of Rioja. You don't really want to see the word low because it could give you the impression of low quality, and that's not the case whatsoever. So it's Rioja Oriental. And it is lower down altitude wise. It is around 200 meters or so less generally, although parts of it can get quite high, but there's not that much of it that's so high. So it's a hotter part of Rioja. It's also got a bit more of that Mediterranean influence as opposed to the Alta and the Alavesa, which are closer to the Atlantic. So we're going to see that different grape varieties are grown in the Rioja Oriental, formerly known as Rioja Baja. Then we've got the Alavesa, and the Alavesa is similar in some ways, Rioja Alta, similar in terms of altitude. It is smaller. It is a little bit cooler and wetter generally overall, and lots of sort of limestone clay soils there as well. Okay, so we'll remember those names because they will become important when we look at some of the newer labelling terms that we're going to see. But overall, we've got 64,000 hectares under vine. It's 100 kilometres roughly from east to west, and and at the widest part it's around 40 kilometres. Okay, so you know, it's not the smallest region in the world. Okay, so we'll have a look at some of these grape varieties. Now there's loads of grape varieties that are actually permitted, lots, and they've introduced more in the past few years. So I'm just going to go through some of the main grape varieties. Some are more important than others. Now, Tempranillo is planted by far the most planted grape variety. In terms of the amount of plantings of black grape varieties, it makes up around 88%. So that's substantial. So you'll see a lot of Tempranillo in the Rioja Alavesa and the Rioja Alta. You'll see more Garnacha in the Rioja Oriental because it's a warmer climate. And Garnacha as a grape variety really needs to be grown in hotter climates. It doesn't like it if it's not warm enough. So Tempranillo as a grape variety, well, it's interesting because it's difficult to say with Tempranillo because if it's grown in so many different places, it's made into so many different styles of wine to say exactly Tempranillo will give you a wine that is like this, 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 and this. On the whole, it doesn't tend to have the highest level of acidity, but that can depend on where it's grown. Fruit-wise, you can get red fruit and you can get black fruit. I would say when it's younger, when you have younger wines, you're probably more likely to get red fruit. And you might get hints of black fruit in more concentrated wines that maybe are for longer aging. In terms of tannins, again, that can vary. Winemaking techniques can mean that you get more or less tannin from your Tempranillo. And also in Rioja, it's blended often. So you're going to get other grape varieties in the blend that are going to affect the levels of tannins that you get, the levels of acidity you get, the body and the alcohol in your wine. So yeah, Tempranillo, it's a bit versatile really, and you can get very different wines, but made with Tempranillo. It really depends where the grapes are grown, the winemaking techniques applied, and then of course if there are other grape varieties that are in the blend there. So talking about Garnacha, now Garnacha is a thin-skinned grape variety. It gets quite big. It accumulates a lot of sugar, so it gives a lot of alcohol to wines. It's red fruit, very much red fruit, a little bit of sort of white pepper spice as well. And it's a nice blending partner for Tempranillo because it does give it that kind of roundness, a little bit of weight to the wines. So yeah, lots, quite, as I said, about 8% Garnacha grown. Graciano, now Graciano, a student told me this recently. They said Graciano, it means Graciano because it gives grace to Tempranillo. I don't know if that's true or not, but it kind of does. It's harder to grow than the other grape varieties. It doesn't ripen quite as easily, but when it does, it really adds a lovely element to the wines It will give more of a floral note. It's got lots of tannin, it's got lots of acidity, it's got black fruit. It's a really great supporting grape variety. So you will find Graciano often blended with the top Rioja wines. It's a bit like, if you know much about Bordeaux, particularly on the left bank, it's a bit like the Petit Verdot of Bordeaux. So that's there are three of our main grape varieties. We've got Mazuelo. Now, Mazuelo is what they call it in Rioja, but it's also known as Cariñena in other parts of Spain, or Carignan, which is what it's called in France. And again, that can add some structure, but we're looking at less than 2% of the plantings for our black grapes. So that, again, gives black fruit, good levels of acidity, good structure, tannins as well there too. Maturana Tinta, tiny amounts, and in fact, there's lots of different kinds of Maturana Tinta. It got a little bit confused when it was planted, so they've just kind of given it the umbrella name. So I can't really say exactly what Maturana Tinta is like, but it is and one of the other grapes that you might get blended. There is now permitted Cabernet Sauvignon. Is permitted as a grape variety, but you won't see a lot of producers using that. They just added a few more to the list, the Consejo Regulador. For our white wines, Viura is our main grape variety, otherwise known as Macabeo, from that's what they call it in Catalonia. Tempranillo Blanco is one of the more notable other white grape varieties that go into the white wines of Rioja. And again, they've allowed international varieties such as Sauvignon Blanc, Verdejo, even though that's not an international grape variety, that is a grape variety that has now been added to the list. Malvasir, there's various other grape varieties, but by far the most planted is Viura. So yeah, lots of permitted grape varieties there, but some definitely more important and more grown than others. Okay, and just on that point, if you have a look at this picture, actually, you can see there's this gnarly old vine here, and these quite stony soil. So the topography is very different, and that's all over Rioja. And that's going to be something to think about a bit later when we look at the future of Rioja and the future of the labelling terms and the way the wines are sold a bit. But there are some bush vines, so these kind of old bush vines, not trellised at all, a bit like this one here, but also there are areas where they've got like the vertical shoot positioning trellised. It really depends. And often with Garnacha, the best way to grow it, because it grows in areas, is bush vines as well, and helps protect it from hot sun where there are areas in Rioja where it is a bit hotter. Okay, right, let's go to the next slide if I can. There we go. All right, so it's very much red wine, but there is great diversity. Okay, so we've got 91% of plantings are of, I say red grape varieties, just black grape varieties actually. So those black grape varieties aren't just going to make red wine. There is some rosé there as well. Rosé that is still, and rosé that is sparkling. But yeah, very much the focus for Rioja is on red wine. There are some white wines. Someone emailed me with a question earlier about the reputation of white wine, so we can maybe discuss that a bit later. Of course, it's not the priority in Rioja, really, to be making white wine when you think of how many black grapes are being grown. But in terms of white wines, there's lots of different styles. You get very easy drinking, fresh, fruity styles. They're fresher and fruitier nowadays than they used to be. But you've also got some that can be aged for such a long time. There's now a new, a slightly new term, Rioja Blanco, where you can use 100% of one grape variety. So it's just a varietal white wine. So then maybe they're doing that with Sauvignon Blanc, for example. A few new things are happening which will come clear as I go on with this presentation. So rosé, yeah, rosé, some of the best rosés are coming from Rioja in Spain. We've got rosé from Navarra, just across the river, Ebro there, but we've got some wonderful rosés, and only recently have they been allowed to make them paler. I wonder why that is. Any ideas, anyone? But there are also some very dark ones, and you can get really aged ones. It's so rare around the world to see oaked rosé wines. So it's very exciting when you can get your hands on an older rosé from Rioja, which has seen some oak. And I think some of you are tasting the Lopez de Heredia wines. They do some older rosés, and they're incredible, unlike anything else you will ever drink, I think, in my personal opinion. So sparkling wine, they are actually permitted to make cava, even though most of it is produced in Penedès and Catalonia, but they are allowed to make cava. However, it's quite political, isn't it? What's going on? We've got the Basque region to the north, we've got Catalonia over to the east, and we've got all this political stuff about, understandably, and so sort of finding independence and having identity. So in Rioja, there is now a movement towards an identity of their own within their sparkling wines, which I'll touch on the next slide. Okay, and here we go. I've got a nice photo here. A lot of these photos I took when I was on my trip a while ago. I'm not 100% sure where I am there, but you can see the mountains, can't you? I mean, you've got in Rioja to the north, you've got the Sierra de Cantabria, which helps to actually shelter it from the Atlantic a bit. And then further south, you've got the Sierra de la Demanda. So you've got mountains all around, and you've got these varying altitudes. It's a stunning, stunning place to go, and looks good, the wine's good, and you're not a million miles from San Sebastian, and you're Pinchos, that's it. If you go into the Basque Alavesa, then you got all of that as well. So lovely. Right, so still and sparkling. So we've got lots of still wines, but let's just talk a little bit about sparkling wine, not for very long, because there's not a lot of it, and it's not really about sparkling wine in this region, but I thought this would be quite interesting for you to know. So of course we've got the cava, but there's now been a new category introduced, and the espumosos, so that would be sparkling, de calidad, of quality from Rioja. Now, I wonder what market or what other sparkling wine they're thinking about when they implemented the rules for the lees aging. If you know anything about, if you have studied maybe level 3 or doing diploma, you may know a little bit about the legal requirements for certain regions of the world for having your wine aging on the lees. And you can see we have a few similarities. Okay, so what we've got here is we've got 15 months lees minimum aging. So if you're going to make an Espumosos de Calidad de Rioja, then it has to have 15 months lees aging minimum. Now, in Champagne, it's 12 months. Okay, so that's even more stringent, even stricter rules. If you're going to have Reserva on the label, and we're going to talk about these labeling terms in a bit, this is slightly different to the other Reserva you might be thinking of. We've got 24 months on the lees there, okay? And then with your Gran Añada, so lots of years basically, we've got 36 months. 36 months, that's the same minimum requirement for a vintage champagne. So here we are. So this is one of the producers I went to. I think this is Bilbanas. And we can see that they're using the A-frames here. So this is where they're storing their sparkling wines while they're on the lees. And at this point, I think this may have been for cava or just their more basic Rioja sparkling wines. How are we doing with the chat? Let me see if how Lydia's coping, or if there's anything I can quickly answer. Yeah, so yeah, exactly. When I was talking about the rosés, yeah, compete with Provence. I believe so with the pale. The oxidative style in White Rioja. I will in a minute, Amiel. That's a good question. And Jonathan is saying, oh, hang on a minute. I need to go back up. So just going back quickly to the pale rosés that have been allowed now. I think we're looking at a market thing here, aren't we, with people expecting those pales that's very fashionable from Provence. Question, Alison, are the rosés from Navarra sweet or dry? Dry, mainly. Sorry. And let me see what else we've got. In fact, if I make this bigger, that'll probably help. Okay, yeah, exactly, Dennis. we are looking at, you've said that Champagne is somewhere that maybe they are thinking about looking at the market there with regards to maybe competing. Who knows? It's a difficult one. It is expensive, and like you mentioned, it is expensive to have that time on the lees. So it'll be interesting to see how that works out for Rioja producers. Which grapes are required in the cavas? Very good question. In fact, it's slightly different for cava in Rioja than it is from Catalonia. So Viera and Chardonnay are the main grape varieties. How soon after the vintage should you be drinking your the older cavas? Well, I don't know really. It depends on the producer. It depends on the style. I imagine the older it is, probably the longer you can keep it for. Any restrictions on the liqueur de tirage or the liqueur d'expedition for these sparkling wines? I really don't know, actually. So Jonathan's asked about restrictions on liqueur de tirage and liqueur d'expedition. So liqueur de tirage is when you add the sugar and the yeast to start the second fermentation, and the liqueur d'expedition is when you add dosage. There is actually, yep, Jonathan, you're not allowed to make it any sweeter than Brut, I believe. So you can have Brut Nature, Extra Brut, and Brut. So these are dry styles of Rioja wines. Dennis, how much are they selling for on average? I don't know. I haven't yet had them. They're quite new. Jim, that picture, yes, they are hand riddling, but they probably aren't riddling all of them. That would just be one of the, maybe they're doing a bit of experimentation most of the time. So if you saw the picture where I had all the bottles stacked, that they don't normally do that, but that's the old way of doing it before machinery was invented in the 70s and 80s to make things a lot easier. Are the requirements for Reserva and Gran Añada also for lees aging or just maturation in bottle? So that's the lees aging. Okay, so it's your 24 months, your 36 months lees aging, and then maturing in bottle. Well, that's up to you. Once you've bought those wines, if you want to keep them, some may keep for, some may. I would say the older, the more time they've had on lees, probably the longer you could keep them for to mature in bottle, and then they'll get a bit more complex. Okay, I will type stuff in at the end for any. I don't think I have any specific vineyards in mind, but anything I need to type, I'll do at the end if that's all right. Gran Añada is a requirement only for vintages, or can you have a Gran Añada non-vintage? Good question. I'm not 100% sure the answer to that, Patricia. I'll have to look that up. Okay. Yeah, you will be able to we will make sure you can access this recording, Michael. Okay. Oh, Lynn said so. Okay, great. And Josiane, is there a rosé cava? I believe there is rosé cava. I would think that for the rosé cava that they would use, I think, Tempranillo and Garnacha. Okay. Oaked Rosado in the market outside of Spain, Renata's asking for. Do you know what? I have had one oaked rosé outside of Spain, and it was a Montepulciano d'Abruzzo. Okay. I'm going to talk a bit about as well leaving not using different labeling terms as well for these still wines. Rahul said, does maturation in bottle change the alcohol content? No, because and does it happen in barrels? In barrels, because you may well get a little bit of evaporation depending on humidity, depending on the conditions. You may that may vary a tiny bit, but you top up barrels, so it doesn't happen that often. In bottle, the alcohol content will stay exactly the same because glass is completely airtight. Okay, so Trepat is using rosé cava. Yes, Trepat is using rosé cava in Catalonia. I'm not 100% sure what they use for the rosé cavas, Heather. In Rioja, it may be the same. I'm not 100% sure there. Okay, and I think Lydia's on top of the questions now, so that's wonderful. Yeah, I mean, you can make some comparisons with what's going on in Cava with the rosés, absolutely. And rosé Cava from Catalonia, they can use Pinot Noir. Yeah, that's absolutely right. Okay, so let's have a look now at the other classification. So I've mentioned a few of the classification systems for sparkling wine, but we've got classification systems that I'm sure you have seen on bottles that you have tasted yourself. And these are the what you should be used to seeing, but you don't have to make wines that are going to be a Criantha Reserva or Gran Reserva. So here we go. Now, generic or joven, so this is like our younger wines, most of the time will have a green label. Okay, now for this, there is no oak aging or bottle aging requirement for these wines. Okay, now, interestingly, I think it's around 40% of Rioja wines have these labeling terms. Okay, the Gran Reserva, the Reserva, Criantha. So there's a lot that don't. So that's because a lot of them are young and fruity, youthful, and easy to drink, entry-level wines. Okay, so if you've got a green label on the back of your Rioja, then most of the time that's going to equate to something that is should be fairly inexpensive, nice and fruity. Okay, however, if you're a Rioja producer and you do not want to do what the Consejo Regulador are telling you to do to make your wine a Criantha or Reserva or Gran Reserva, and I'll tell you what you have to do to make wines with those labeling terms. If you decide you don't want to do that, then you will have to again use this generic label, so the green label on the back. So there are some producers who decided not to do that, so the vinos de autor, so the wine, the kind of outside winemakers are referring to themselves. This is in the 90s. And they decided to do things a little bit differently. A lot of these were based in the Rioja Alavesa in the Basque country, so no surprises there. But there's been some wonderful wines. There are some wonderful wines coming from all over Rioja where they've decided to do things a little bit differently, and we'll see why. Because if you make a Criantha wine, then you have to age your wine in oak. And this is for red wines. I'm talking about red wines. It's slightly different for white and for rosé. Okay, so you have to age your wine in oak for a year, and overall 2 years. Okay, so you would, if I went to the shops now, it would be impossible for me to buy a Criantha 2019. Okay. Now, thank you, Adela, for that point. You just said that young normally are carbonic maceration. I will talk about that. In fact, I meant to talk about that. So I'm going to come back to that. So for those of you that don't know what carbonic maceration is a way of making a wine really fruity and less tannic. Okay, so if you've had a Beaujolais wine, just a basic Beaujolais, you'll get this kind of slightly bubblegummy, banana-y character, very fruity, low tannins. You can chill them, really easy to drink. And yeah, they do that. I would say they don't do full carbonic maceration, they do sort of semi-carbonic maceration, and this would be for the reds. Okay, it only applies for red wines. So yeah, a lot of very, very fruity wines that have seen some form of carbonic maceration in that generic level. When we get to Criantha, that's generally not what you do. The aim here is to have a wine where you've got a bit more complexity. Still pretty easy drinking. The Spanish love Crianthas. It's their favorite level of Rioja. And I tell you what, I think they've got great taste, because I love a Criantha as well. I think it's a really good go-to wine if you want to have, if you're having a meal and you want something that, it's an everyday kind of wine, but it's got a bit of oak. It's got a bit more going on. And I love a bit of oak in my wines. So that's brilliant. Okay, so a Criantha you'd expect to have still fairly youthful, but not as youthful as a lot of your generic wines. So your Criantha now, we're looking at a little bit of oak spice, probably more red fruit than black fruit here. Medium-ish tannins, but medium-bodied most of the time. Lovely. Okay. Just had a question from Mino about roble, the labelling term roble. Now, the labelling term roble simply means oak. I haven't seen it a lot in Rioja, although I've seen it quite a lot in Ribera de Duero. It just means there's been a little bit of oak on the wine, but not enough to make it a Criantha. So that hopefully answers your question, Mine. Peter, is the term generic a replacement for joven? Well, I think there was a problem with the word joven, because if you're saying joven is linked to this label, it's not entirely. And joven is not a labelling term. You don't see the word joven on a bottle of wine usually. So it really means that it doesn't hit the requirement to be Criantha Reserva, Gran Reserva. I mean, maybe generic is not the best word either. So Kelsey, I said that 1 year is your minimum requirement in oak, and then 2 years overall aging. So yeah, it could be a year in bottle, it could be 2 years in oak, but it's 2 years overall with a minimum year in oak. Jonathan, you said at a Ribera de Duero webinar you attended the other day, gave the impression that Roble would be coming in as a legal term in due course. I've seen it on bottles, so I don't know, to be honest. All I know is I've seen it on some label bottles of wine, relatively inexpensive bottles of wine often, and yeah, then I've seen that they've had a bit of oak on them, and that's what I've been told when I was in Ribera de Duero a while ago. But do you know what? What's the fascinating thing about Spain is things are changing all the time. Okay, so with our Reserva now. Reserva, we've got more time now overall aging. Okay, so the time in oak, the minimum requirement in oak is the same as Criantha, but usually more. Most producers will do more, and that's one year again, but 3 years overall aging. Now remember, this is for red wines. For white wines and rosés, it's less generally. Okay, now what I need to be very specific about is you might think, well, okay, I'm a producer and I'm doing the minimum requirements, but I'm choosing to use the green labeling term. Well, because as well as having these minimum requirements, you have to use 225 litre barriques to age your wines in. These are the Bordeaux size barrique. That's where they got the inspiration from. So and I'll show you a photo on a slide that's coming up, and you'll see that not all producers in the world like to be told that they have to age their wine in 225 litre barriques. So that's where you might find a producer saying, well, actually, in fact, I got a quote directly from a producer in Rioja saying that they preferred the oak integration with the wine when they used barrels that were 500 litres. So they made their wines in 500 litres barrels. Therefore, they were not able to put Criantha or Reserva on the label, or even Gran Reserva. So that's our Reserva. So with the Reserva wine now, I'm expecting there to be more intensity. Just overall, we've got more red fruit, a bit more black fruit here now. We've got more oak. Generally, you would see more oak. Probably more new oak is being used as well. And I'm going to talk about oak a bit more in a bit. And I'd expect to be starting to get some tertiary characteristics, as well as like vanilla and cedar and smoke from the oak, and lovely characteristics from the grapes as well. Maybe we've got a bit of Graciano in here, so we've got that kind of more perfumed black fruit and some red fruit. We are now looking at tertiary, so dried fruit characteristics, a little bit leathery, earthy, all of that kind of stuff going on. So these are starting to get a bit more complex now, and these are stunning wines. And price-wise, when we talk about Rioja, we're talking about a place that is making wine that they're aging. They're aging their Crianthas, they're aging their Reservas, they're aging their Gran Reservas. They know the quality. They've got wonderful quality here. They can age these wines. So that's what we've got for our Reserva. And we in the UK, we love a Reserva. We really, really do. So just a brief recap of the size of the barrels: 225 litre. Okay, and we refer to that size as a barrique often. It's a 225 litre barrel. I will show you some on the next slide. And that is the requirement if you're going to make a Criantha, a Reserva, a Gran Reserva wine in Rioja, not sparkling. That is the barrel requirement, although some producers like to use bigger barrels, but then they can't use that terminology. Okay. Nick, you drink Rioja Reserva every day. Brilliant. All right, so Gran Reserva. So now Gran Reserva, we're getting really, really serious here. Okay, we have got a lot of time in oak now. Okay, so we are looking at a minimum now of 2 years in oak, 5 years aging overall. And these are the minimum requirements. So let me stress that these are the minimum requirements. Most producers will do more than that. Okay. But then again, of course, there is different quality within all of these. If you go to the shops and you've got your shelves there, and you've got a Grand Reserva there for 15 quid, and you've got a Grand Reserva there for 45 quid, there'll be a reason why they're different, they're priced differently, and that won't just be marketing, okay? You know, there are different qualities within these categories, which is what is quite controversial about Rioja, and which is why I'll talk about these other labelling terms in a bit, because even though this dictates the size of the oak and the amount of time in oak and the amount of time in bottle, it doesn't dictate the quality of the grapes, okay? So that is something to bear in mind. So there will be producers out there who have really top reputations, or there'll be particular wines from particular producers that have really top reputations as well. So let's just have a look. Someone's asked about the labelling colours. Yes, they are. Right, so here we go. Criantha will have this kind of red, sort of scarlet red colour on the back of the bottle. Reserva will have more of this kind of burgundy maroon red colour, and then Grand Reserva has got a blue. Okay, now with our Grand Reserva, now because we've got more time in oak and we've got more time overall aging, we can expect a wine that's incredibly complex. They won't necessarily make a Grand Reserva wine every year, and these wines will have a lot more of those tertiary bottle mature character in them. So you're going to expect more dried fruit, more earthy, leathery, forest floor characteristics, and you know, lots of sort of that kind of fig, prune stuff going on. Also oak. It might be at this point that you've got a wine that you don't need to age any longer. In fact, that's one of the wonderful things about Rioja, is that they've done the aging for you. If a wine has been released from Rioja, they're telling you can drink it now, it's going to be great. You can possibly keep it as well. Some producers will release them earlier, you can keep them. Some producers will release them, you know, really at the point where this is it now, drinking time. So Karen Deep has asked, can we expect a heavily oaked wine with a generic label? You could do, you absolutely could do. But what you will probably see, what I would do with one of these wines, which I've labeled as generic, really here, I'm kind of talking about the young ones, okay, what was known as Joven. But if you do have a green label on the back, if it's pretty costly and it's got a vintage on it that's quite a bit older, I'd expect there's probably been quite a bit of winemaking going on, and there'll be great grapes, okay? And someone is sharing some great websites, I think, so thank you, Jonathan. Okay, yeah, I mean, I don't really have time to type in all of my favourite producers right now, but those of you that have got some favourite producers, please feel free to type them in as well. And I think we will see quite a few of the Lopez de Heredia, Vineyard Tondonias, etc. They're very classic, very traditional styles. Going to Attardi, thank you, Miguel, who is a more modern style, one of the pioneers of the new labelling terms that we're going to see. Okay, yeah, seeing some great producers here. Thank you for sharing those. All right, so I'm going to move on to the next slide. Feel free to keep adding your questions. Oh, Adela, I see you going for Baghori there. I visited Baghori. It's unlike anything I've ever seen in terms of a winery. So incredible and technological. Okay, right, so next slide. Right, so oak and other winemaking. So I've talked about oak quite a bit, but I just want to emphasize a little bit more about it, really. So you're asking about the wine barrel sizes, and here we go. So this is from Bilbernes, which is based in Rioja Alta, in the town of Aro, and called Bilbernes because the people that started the winery were from Bilbao. And you can see lots and lots of these barriques, okay? These look particularly new to me. So now, I was just about to come on to that, Alex. You're asking about French oak, more commonplace than American in Rioja. So yes, it's looking that way. So American oak, particularly with the links to the colonies, getting the Americas, getting the oak over from there was not a problem. You'll see that a lot of traditional places, Jerez, American oak is used, but definitely there's been much more of a move towards French oak. So what's the difference? The price, okay? American oak is cheaper than French oak. So why are people spending more? Who knows? It's probably more to do with the style. And the fact is, with French oak, You can be very tightly grained, maybe got less of an oxidative style coming through with French oak. French oak, well, let's say American oak. With American oak, you get coconut characteristics, like dill character, very, very vanilla-y. You still get vanilla and cloves and sweet spices with French oak, and maybe not quite as overtly vanilla-y. But yeah, there's definitely a move towards a slightly less oxidized style and the use of French oak. But there's still lots and lots of producers being very traditional with more oxidative styles. And you mentioned before, someone asked about the oxidative styles of white wines. So a lot of the white wines sit in that more generic category: fresh, easy drinking, young, fruity, inexpensive. But there are some producers who are making some very, very heavily oxidized white wines. Lopez de Heredia, again, that's probably the best example I can give you. It's the one I've tasted the most of, definitely in that style. Although actually Marques de Murrieta do one as well, Castillo Iguay. Now, those wines are meant for bottle aging. So they've had a bit of oxidative aging in the oak, and then they develop over time and they become quite golden in colour, and they get these sort of nutty characteristics. And really dried fruit, honeyed, stunning, stunning wines. I've heard that they have been voted very highly when it comes to cheese and wine pairings, and the nuttiness that you get from these wines. Really, really brilliant. Okay, so a few questions. Does the harvest determine if that vintage is going to be Joven or Reserve, etc.? Not so much the harvest. There is vintage variation, of course, but having that proximity in Rioja to the Atlantic, you are going to get vintage variation, and they do classify their vintages going from like good to amazing. I think what they mean is not so good to amazing, so they do classify their vintages, but there isn't, you know, in terms of vintage variation, it exists, but I wouldn't say it's as extreme as in some other parts of Europe. And what they will do is they'll have certain vineyards generally that they would have certain grapes would go into, either your Crianza Reserva, Gran Reserva, or the younger ones. Definitely, they'll pick the grapes and they'll make sure that they are the quality that they need to be to go into the right category, because you need better quality grapes as you go up that pyramid, because you need them to have the structure to age for such a long time. Okay, so I'm just here, I just wanted to show you that we've got bigger oak, obviously, here. And so we might expect that the Joven or the generic wines could be aged in these or in stainless steel. Okay, so that's because that's a photo I had from my bank of Rioja photos there. Okay, I mean, it's not just French and American oak as well. They are, you know, using oak from Croatia, Slovenia, all over the place. And just going back to winemaking, I've got a little photo here of someone punching down. See that plate there? So they're punching down. This is getting some extraction. So this is what we're probably looking at, a wine that's going to be potentially a Gran Reserva or a Reserva. Lydia, you're doing a great job answering the questions. Thank you. Takes quite a bit of pressure off me. To think earlier, I said, I'll be fine, Lydia. You don't need to answer any questions. And can you imagine? Right. So there's the oak, clearly very important. The size of oak, important for the classifications, for the legal requirements for certain labelling terms as well. And of course, I didn't talk about the aging for white and rosé, but the minimum oak aging for white and rosé wines is 6 months across the board, and then longer in bottle. But of course, but for those wines, as you get to the Reserva, Gran Reserva, you have more time in bottle. So, come on, why do you say punching down means Gran Reserva? That was just a comment. What I'm seeing here is they're trying to, punching down and pumping over is a way of extracting tannins and colour. And if you want to extract a lot of tannins and colour, often your aim is the tannins will give structure to a wine. And if you're doing sort of extensive extraction, then you're probably looking to make a wine that's going to age for a long time, possibly. Whereas with our more generic red wines, we're looking for, we're doing that carbonic maceration that I mentioned before, which is trying not to extract so much tannin. Okay, it's just some winemaking techniques. So red and white on the label, yeah. So if you have a white Rioja that is a Crianza, it will have the same labeling term, but the time in oak will be less, probably, okay, because it's not really the style. And we've got tannins, and if you've got tannins in wines, they suit oak really well. Oak softens tannins, so longer time in oak softens those tannins, but tannins do give structure. So lots of things to consider. You can take in as much of this as you want. I don't expect you to remember everything. I just want to give you a good overview and a bit of an understanding of the region and just all of the stuff that they're doing, because there's so much going on. Okay, so here we go. So we've got some wine labelling terms, we've got some recent changes, very recent changes. You know, these changes were agreed in 2017, they were published in 2018, and we are going to start seeing the first of these wines in this year, which is very, very exciting. And someone mentioned the producer Artadi earlier from the Alavesa. You know, we had groups of producers in the 90s who really didn't want to be labelling their wines the Rioja. If you get a bottle of Rioja now, it will just have just Rioja written on it. That doesn't give you any clue as to whereabouts in Rioja the wine is made. Now, traditionally, they did blend across the whole region, because you had some Tempranillo here, you had some Garnacha here, and blending can do wonderful, wonderful things. It can give you, it can give complexity, it can give consistency, it can give balance to wines. You know, I'm all for blends. So let's look at the Southern Rhone. That's brilliant. You know, Bordeaux, we've got blends. But then on the other hand, we've got areas, regions like Burgundy, where it's, you know, the most expensive, most prestigious wines from one single vineyard. Okay, so, you know, these are wines that are championed, world-class wines. So there's arguments for both. So you've got some producers who will blend across the whole region, and you've got some producers who are more inclined, their idea and their winemaking, what they want is more of an expression of their terroir. So I'm going to talk about what these terms mean in just 1 second. Just had a question from Tony. Are Rioja Reds mainly fermented in barrel? No, that was just one picture. You know, you can ferment in stainless steel and you can ferment in barrel. Most of the time when you ferment red wines, they ferment in stainless steel. But that was just a big old oak barrel there. Oh, I'm really glad that we're getting some lovely recommendations still of some wonderful wines here. So I'm going to talk a little bit about these recent changes and these labelling terms that we will see. We haven't seen them yet because it only just really started, 2018. And these wines, we would expect all of these wines to have some significant time in oak, or at least in bottle. So they won't quite be on the shelves yet. I was seeing, looking back at some emails and stuff recently, and they said, oh, in this year at Provine, we were going to get to taste the first of these. Unfortunately, with the times we're in now, that's not possible, but hopefully they will be reaching the shelves and our homes in the not too distant future. So start with Vino di Zona. Now, Vino di Zona, that is your zone, and we saw those zones. Those zones are the Rioja Alta, the Rioja Alavesa, the Rioja Oriental. So if you are growing your grapes in that zone, okay, okay, you're allowed to grow a few of them just outside, but only up to 15% in the neighbouring zone. So you grow your grapes in that zone, then you can label the name of the zone on the bottle. So that's going to give some, maybe for some producers, they'll feel that will give their wine a bit more identity. So if they are just making, they're growing their grapes and they're making their wines from the Rioja Alta, they can just put Rioja Alta on the label, not to be confused with the producer La Rioja Alta. Okay, so that's our Vino di Zona. Now with this, we're following a kind of a Burgundian thing now, because we're going Vino de Municipio. Now Vino de Municipio is similar-ish to our communes or our villages in Burgundy. So like, you know, your Meursault or your Gevrey Chambertin, for example, though hopefully not as expensive. And so you've got to grow those grapes in that municipality. And at the moment there's 145 municipalities. I don't really know any of them. And so I'm looking forward to learning about which municipalities are going to be the Gevrey Chambertin of Rioja. It's going to be very interesting to find out. At the moment, Rioja Alta has 77 of these municipalities. Rioja Oriental has 50 and Rioja Alavesa has 18. So lots to learn. It's going to make the diploma really hard. Maybe it won't. I hope not. It's already quite difficult. So here we've got, again, you can grow a little bit outside that municipality, just 15% rule applies again. But the wines do have to be made in that municipality. So it's a little bit unlike in Burgundy, where actually you can make the wine outside. The grapes have to come from the village or the commune, but you can make the wine outside, but not so for the Vino de Municipios. Now, the Viñedo Singular, I mean, this is happening already. So this is not a new thing. It's just these are now going to be labelling terms that you can use. I mean, Artadi have been making single vineyard wines for a long time, and they are not cheap. But the Viñedo Singular, well, that's your single vineyard. Now, they're bit stricter rules here, so you know, we're going to have to work out which of these vineyards are producing these wonderful grapes to make these top Riojas in the first place. But they definitely are going to have some old vines, because the vineyards have to be minimum of 35 years old. Anyone making these wines as well has had to have been you know, making wine for 10 years anyway, need to know what they're doing. Can't just come in and decide that they're going to make a single vineyard wine. That would just be nonsense. You can't do that. And the yields are even lower, okay, for these single vineyard wines. I think about 20% lower than the average yield. I'm not 100% sure about that. Hand harvesting is a must, okay. And there's going to be lots of checks. They're going to do lots of chemical checks to make sure these wines are from where they say they are, and also they're going to be lots, you know, tasting checks, of scientific checks, but also tasted by panels as well to make sure they're up to scratch. So some very stringent rules will apply. So what is going to happen? I mean, it's going to be really interesting to see when these take off, to see if within this using these labelling terms, are they still going to be making Grand Reserva wines? And what exactly are we going to see on the labels? We will see the name of the single vineyards, of course, and I should think which municipality that's linked to, and probably the zone as well. But it's going to be so exciting to see what happens. What might not be so favourable for me, but I think good for Spain in general, is the prices will probably go up. You know, if you're getting these exclusive single vineyard Rioja wines, and Rioja is great, as we're here because we want to know more about Rioja, because we love Rioja, so I'm preaching to the converted. But you know, we're going to be seeing some incredible wines. They exist already, but they're just the exposure isn't there. So hopefully this will help to increase exposure to some of the incredibly fine wines. That's not to say that you can't get really fantastic wines that are blended from across the regions as well. Okay, so there's a bit of discussion here about rosé and Riojas. Where can you get them from? They're not as easy because there's not so much of them is made, but thank you. So you can get some from Majestic, can you? Good to know. I tend to buy my Spanish wines when I'm down in Spain. It's cheaper and there's more of them. Dennis, good point. He said that he hopes it won't be as messy as in Saint-Emilion. Yeah, you know, there's been lots of problems in Bordeaux with promoting places and then demoting places. You've got to be very careful, you know, really strict. If you're going to give a municipality you know, a certain prestige because it's one of the ones that's allowed to be labeled, it can't go down in quality, can it? It's going to be yeah, I mean, it takes a long time to get these things started. I mean, it's a very traditional place, Rioja, very traditional place. It's been around for a long time. This is a big thing that's happening right now. You know, this is not to be underestimated, moving to these labelling terms and to this way of doing things. It's not something that's traditionally been done, so it's incredibly exciting. Yes, so Michelle has just asked for my email address. Absolutely, I will give that to you. So if you have any further questions, if you want the presentation, I'm more than happy to share that with you. So that brings me to the end of what I have to say. And of course, you know, any questions you have, please ask. And I would really like a glass of rosé Rioja right now, but I'm just going to have to stick with the sherry that I haven't tasted for an hour because I've been talking for so long. Yeah, please keep asking questions. You can see we've got loads more stuff coming up. We've got gin tomorrow. If the weather's nice, you can maybe pop some tonic in with that. We've got our quiz on Thursday, really good fun. We've got Cabernet Sauvignon with Lydia, who's here as well, so she'll be telling you all about that fabulous grape. And then there's whiskey as well, so this is next week. Whiskey is one of our spirits experts. So yeah, loads going on. So question from Daniel. So how long can you keep a Grand Reserva for? How long is a piece of string? It depends on the producer. Some, if it's a very traditional, you probably want to drink them fairly quickly, and some you might be able to keep for 3-4 years, who knows. Okay. Lydia, can you answer the questions about where to get the recording from?